So my name is Ramya Reddy, and I am a professional photographer and author by virtue of The Soul of the Nilgiris. I started out my mm, uh, photographic journey in the Nilgiris. I studied at the Light and Life Academy, and I started off my photographic journey in the Nilgiris, and that's how my Nilgiris journey started at large. And I work in both commercial and independent uh, domains. I've worked in the Nilgiris and created the Soul of the Nilgiris over the course of, it was a slow burn project over the course of 9 years. And it started out as a photo series and then evolved into this book. Worked extensively with 5 native communities. And yeah, that's a little bit about me. Yeah, I live between Bangalore and now Kunur. So a proud Nilgiris resident too now. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And Andrew.
Okay, well, thank you all for joining us with this really wonderful panel of 2 authors who've deeply immersed themselves in the Nilgiris. So we have some unique insights that we're going to learn about this evening. I'm Andrew Wilford. I'm part of the Nilgiri Field Learning Center with Keystone and Cornell. Our partnership has lasted several years. I've worked with students from the community and from Cornell on research projects on varied topics. My area of work has focused on community wellness and mental health. And so I have a perspective that's very human-oriented, but working with Janagiamma, who I'm thrilled to see on the call tonight in this conversation, has broadened my view of community wellness to think of, and also with other senior healers, but Janagiamma has been instrumental, as Pratim had pointed out, for thinking deeply about reciprocity. Reciprocity with ancestor, trees, water, rocks, animals, and so on and so forth. I'm reminded of one of our early exercises that we engaged in with Keystone students from the communities, primarily Urala and Kurumba students, who did an exercise on who am I, comparing Cornell students' version of themselves with students in the Nilgiris from the region. And the Cornell students characteristically would draw a cartoon-style head with all sorts of thoughts popping out of it, and sort of existential questions about their life, their predicament, what they're going to do as an individual with their life. And the Keystone students in another part of the room were drawing rivers, trees, rocks, devashola, all sorts of nice features of the environment that was part of their identity and integrated within their identity. And that was a real eye-opener for me in that first year of our program, learning to think relationally and not as self-contained units, atomized units, and how important that is. And we're going to sort of see that relationality at work in the 2 authors who are going to discuss their engagement with the Nilgiris. But before we go into that, I just want to thank Pratim, Ramya, and Vasanth for giving us the gift of this conversation and hosting it, and to all of you, wherever you are, for joining in this dialogue. We will have some time for Q&A at the end after the authors have conversed with one another and in response to questions that I will give them, but you will have an opportunity to ask them questions as well. One of the things I've learned from Janagiamma, and we will bring her into the conversation, is that when we think about wellness, when we think about health, when we think about a community in a sense of well-being, diagnosis in the sort of way we think about mental health is far less important than dialogue. That's part of the local wisdom, being connected to others, but also having food security and social and ritual connectivity, connections with one another, is so important. So dialogue in many domains with other human beings and with the non-human world as well. Wellness in the context of these communities is not an objective, measurable table of symptoms or their absence, but a quality of life that is integrated within social and physical ecologies. And the lines between these two ecologies are not so differentiated. It's a kind of continuum of existence. And we'll hear again these ideas exemplified in our authors in different ways. So when we think of healing in the Kurumba, Alu Kurumba context, or in many other communities, and also in indigenous communities around the world, it's a kind of continuum of existence. It integrates mind, body, and spirit within a particular environment. That doesn't mean there are not challenges that come with change. Of course, things have really rapidly escalated with climate change and environmental change and monocropping and all sorts of toxicities that have introduced into the environment as one thing comes to impact another with an accelerated domino effect, the pandemic being the latest and most catastrophic example of that. So we will want to talk about changes and responses and resilience to those changes. And we will certainly ask Janagiamma's insights in that aspect of what she sees changing and where resilience might still exist. So with that little introduction, I wanted to begin our conversation with our authors and just ask a very simple question to start off with. And we can start with Ramya can begin, and then Vasanth can weigh in, and feel free to address each other. You don't have to just address the audience. You can converse with one another and ask each other questions. So the first question is really, how did you come to the Nilgiris? What inspired you to spend almost a decade doing research in this place? And how has it changed your thinking broadly about existence and about planet Earth? Ramya, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Andrew. It's such a pleasure to be talking to you, and I've not had enough time to look at all the things that you've done, but I'm just so honored that to be conversing with you today. Thank you. So how did I come to the Nilgiris? As a little girl with my mountain loving parents, and we would take little breaks, and the family had a preference to get away to the mountains, so be it Nandi Hills or the Nilgiris, Ooty. And in fact, there was not very much at the time. So I got to the hills at the time, and then we kept coming back, visiting again and again. And I came back a full circle and enrolled in a photography school in the Nilgiris in Ooty. And I spent a couple of very impressionable years in Ooty at the Light and Life Institute. And it transformed me from true blue city girl to something much more. And I started to acquaint myself with the landscape, and as a rookie photographer, started photographing landscapes, and with an intent of creating a photo series. But then my relationship with the Nilgiris was changing and evolving, and I met someone who loved the mountains himself, and we started to come back even after my course. And the process of photographing and documenting the place continued. And there was a point when I started to interact with the indigenous people. Up until that point, that did not happen. This was around 2009 or so. And that changed the trajectory of the project. And I was so moved by their worldviews, and there was also a sadness that started to, creep in, because I could see that the loss of um, a depletion of not only the resources, the landscape, but also uh, so many indigenous legacies, their stories and wisdom. So that prompted me to make a departure from the making this all about photography and also engage with documenting by way of writing and conversation. As the conversations deepened and I got to know them a little more, and I was exploring how I wanted to represent them, and this is something I'm still working on and exploring because uh, mm, I'm still not satisfied with the representation part. Probably will come back to it a little later. And I'd like your thoughts on this too, as writers and artists and academics. We always grapple with that uh, representation bit. So that was a trajectory, and then I got into I immersed myself in field trips, meeting the locals and indigenous people, natives, indigenous, however they wanted to be uh, uh, recognized. And I chose 5 communities because from an access point of view, that was uh, convenient. I do think I should have extended it. I probably will in the future. So I worked largely with the Toda community, with Kurumbas, with Irulas, um, mm, Kotas and Badagas. And there were lots of people instrumental in this journey, including anthropologists, writers, poets, mm, and uh, as you know, the Nilgiri, as the I'm sorry, the Keystone Foundation and Pratim, to be specific. So that was the evolution of the book. And one thing that I have to say was along the way, I felt like, again, bringing the representation bit, I just started to feel that um, there was, my process was creating a lot of distance between my process and the communities. So I tried to involve them as much as I could. There's one thing that uh, I uh, it was more of an experiment, but we had the Toda women artisans um, create the spines for this book. So that's just an example. So where community involvement was there in the course of making this book. So this is a short gist of my journey with Soul of the Nilgiris.
Thank you, Ramya. And if folks want to know what she's talking about here, this is the beautiful spine with the Toda embroidery on the book itself. It's quite unique and gives a real feeling for the Nilgiris as you hold it in your hand, which is lovely. Your issue of representation strikes me as very important because, you know, sometimes the way in which communities that are distressed by global forces is done in such a way that they appear almost as pure victims, as abject, as somehow not having agency. And one of the nice things you really capture in your work, Ramya, if I may say so, in many ways better than a lot of anthropology works, is the agency and the spirit of the people. The soul of the Nilgiris is in the title, and you really feel the soul of the people throughout the book. Vasanth, in a little bit different style, is trained to focus more on the environmental science, whereas you were really emphasizing the human element in this. So it's interesting that we bring these together because you're both interested in bridging the human non-human divide, but have different backgrounds and different experiences. So that is really quite a fascinating meeting of the minds. Vasanth, why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to the Nilgiris now?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Andrew. And it was lovely to hear your journey again, Ramya. And so I was born here, and but I spent like I guess the first 2-3 years of my life here, and then I grew up in the city. I grew up in Chennai. I studied in Chennai, but I studied in a school that encouraged nature and environmental education. It's called the school KFI, Krishnamurti Foundation of India, and so our school itself in Chennai was like a mini forest inside the city. So I've always been exposed to walking in nature, observing nature. And as a young kid, I used to keep coming back to the Nilgiris, and even before I knew the words like nature and ecology, I could the divide between the forest and then human dominated landscapes was kind of like deeply ingrained in me. Like I always had this feeling that boundary had to be pushed, and I wasn't very comfortable with that. And so it was a dream for me, like growing up in the city, and that I would one day come back to the Nilgiris and work with extending this boundary. And but I didn't have a clear plan, and obviously, I had other interests also at that time, like. But as I studied and I did a course, I mean, environmental management, and so when I finished school and I was just starting college and all, I had this plan that I should come up with something where I end up making like a lot of money, and then I'll buy a lot of land next to the foothills and then grow forests. But that plan didn't quite work. So I started studying ecology, and I started. I thought that if I have to grow the forests and things back, then I have to know what the forest is, and I have to know the species, and I have to know the plants, and I need to know how to grow these ecosystems back. So I started studying this, and a lot of it was self-taught, and I just used to walk the forest myself, and for the first 3 years over here. And before that, I did a course in Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary. It's like a refuge for plants of the Western Ghats that's run by a small community, and so I learned hands-on techniques on how to work with setting up nurseries and growing plants from that place. And yes, and so I started exploring the forests here and learning about the species. And then I got a chance to set up my own nursery, and I focused on all the kinds of species, not just trees, but grasses, shrubs, herbs, and with the intention of doing like holistic ecological restoration. And yeah, so that's been my journey to the Nilgiris in short. And in terms of how I see the Nilgiris as like compared, I mean, the perspective that I've got from the Nilgiris on the rest of the world, like I would just like to share an image that I made, which is also there in my book. So can I just share my screen now? So can you see this image? Yeah, so this is a map that I drew of the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve and how it would have been before all the changes started happening, like major changes of landscape and land use change. So I see the Nilgiri Biosphere Reserve as a microcosm of Earth. So every there's almost like 7 different forest types and ecotypes in this place. And for me, like that was like extremely like intriguing and interesting, because I got to like learn about so many different forest and ecotypes in a small landscape. It's a relatively small area, which is like about 5,000 square kilometers. And this place also supports close to 20 different types of indigenous people's communities. So in many ways, it's like a microcosm of Earth. And in addition to this, now it also has like almost every single kind of problem and issue that you would find in landscapes all around the world. I just want to show you another map of the different kinds of problems and issues. So this is like a map that I created of a schematic map of the various problems and issues that this biosphere is facing now. So in this way also, it's like a microcosm of Earth. It's got almost every single pressure and detrimental aspects. So I felt that trying to work out holistic solutions for this landscape is like equal to like, I mean, if the solutions can work here, I mean, they can be applied and worked in any part of the world. So, so for me, it was like, I was really interested in coming up with solutions, in holistic solutions, and seeing this place as the world for me, and coming up with solutions here, which I would then intend to connect with other places in the world and put it out and collaborate for larger global change. So so this has been my journey in short, and perspective, and almost portal to the rest of the world. Yeah.
Thank you, Vasanth. Would it be possible to go back to the normal so we can?
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you. I think, Vasanth, my next question is directly following what you've begun to discuss, and I will allow you to elaborate further then with Ramya together. And Ramya, you can go first. But really what you're pointing to, Vasanth, is that a lot of our work in science and in social science as well tends to be dualistic. We separate humans from their environments. We separate culture from nature, mind from body, animals from humans. But your work, Vasanth and Ramya, both, and the broader work of the Keystone Foundation for almost 30 years now, or maybe we have hit 30 years, I can't remember. We've been challenged to rethink these dualistic tendencies, because these dualistic tendencies have not served our planet well. And so we have to have a new lens for thinking about, a new way of thinking about sustainable livelihoods, environments, culture, and nature as an integrated whole. And maybe we can address the sort of contemporary moment. Can we comment on this critical moment in rethinking and reassessing in light of the specific challenges that lie before us? Climate change, pollution and toxicity, the pandemic, social and economic fractures, the collapse of cultural systems that Ramya had mentioned, the loss of some of this indigenous knowledge, and so on and so forth. So maybe we should comment on how your work addresses this critical moment and a need to think differently about it. Ramya, you go first.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. So When I started working with the indigenous people, the one thing that which you also briefly pointed out, stood out was the ecosystem people, as I'd like to call them, Adivasis, ecosystem people. They viewed themselves as members of a community and beings in coexistence with all all sentient creatures, and they revered and protected them. They had sacred groves, and they had names, and they had names for their peaks and their forests and their water systems and so on and so forth. So for what I started to uh, observe was that uh, it's manifold. And one was the loss of this, not only for us, but even among them. And now, if something like that happens, uh, one thing that stood out in all of my conversations with them was one recurrent theme, apart from seeing themselves as members of a community and coexistence and so on and so forth, was how they lived in adherence to seasons. And even now, there was, uh, however fragmented, you would still find it. And all of this was at a loss. So, in the current context, uh, I think we have all become so disenfranchised from these learnings, and there is resistance on our part, unbeknownst to ourselves. It's happened even with me, and it still happens. Uh, whilst we like to talk about this and so on, adapting to it is something else. And when I say this, I don't mean that we should become like that. Adapt and, you know, live with the ways that the our indigenous people. We don't have to mimic that, but we can bring some of it into our fold. And this is something that I find all of us are grappling with. How much ever, how however much we know about this, or how whatever the awareness. So this is something I've seen, and to address it, how do we address it? That is a very, very complex uh, uh, problem, and it's very simple of me to say that we could start thinking of alternative ways of seeing things, of uh, lifestyles, and so on. But uh, first thing I would say, the way to go about this uh, is to first uh, profoundly recognize uh, this uh, this loss, and recognize the the mm, uh, inequitable uh, development that we have all succumbed to, and mm, uh, stop objectifying what we think we are learning from them, and instead uh, just have a broader set, a more open sense to imbibe these learnings from different systems of knowledge from the indigenous world. And this is especially uh, resonant, contextual in the times that we're living in, like you said. uh, um, the all manner of uh, everything from ecological destruction to climate change and so on and so forth. So this is just one step in that direction, um, to first recognize. And yeah, I hope I somewhat answered, but this is drawing from my learnings, and I cannot complete that answer because I don't know myself, and I don't know if I have fully recognized and understood these other knowledge systems that and the essences of those from
No,
the
that's a very
community.
important point. Thank you. I mean, because part of the first step would be admitting that we don't know, that
Yeah,
the kind of indicators that we use to talk about qualities of life and development, um, whether it's in health, education, economics, we just don't really know whether those basic indicators are serving us well. And
yeah.
first step is to admit what we don't know. So, Vasanth, why don't you tackle the same tough question? And then after that, we'll bring Janagiamma to reflect on the changes, the things that Ramya has pointed out, that Vasanth has pointed out, some of the things she's observed in her lifetime. So you go first, Vasanth.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So in my journey of understanding this landscape and with the book, I have, I think by default, the way I learn and way I make connections when learning, I've kind of tried to bridge the boundaries between ecology, plants, and geology, and climate, and human geography, and which is also one reason why it's taken me like 9 years to write the book. I had to put everything down, make sure all the connections are translated in the book, and all the ideas and and arguments are tied to or there are no loose ends, yeah, like what I learned in the first year of exploring like was really important in the last legs of completing the theories and what I'm proposing. So and I feel that one of the effects of this dualistic process and approach has been the disconnect of human communities and man from nature, and the huge detriment to life, basically rest of life, and the biodiversity loss and the loss of habitats. And so I feel one of the most important things would be to understand that there's a much larger intelligence in nature and sophistication in nature, and it's much more interconnected than what we think it is, and that's something that I try to portray and communicate with my book. And for example, how the plants and the geology has worked together in forming this incredibly capable landscape in supporting life. It's like the more deeper you dig, it's just amazing the kind of precision that would have been needed in terms of time, in terms of exact positions of different geological features, and yeah, in terms of like plant movements, like 50 million years ago, how like the grass is coming here, and the ice age happening, and so it all seems like clockwork and precision, extreme precision in being able to support a huge amount of life. And that's what this landscape, I think, is special for, is the capacity to support a huge amount of diversity, not just in terms of species, but in terms of like heterogeneous landscapes, which then allow different human communities to engage and live with them also. So I feel that this landscape, especially the Nilgiris and Aadhimalai and Upper Sri Lanka, I call them like sister landscapes, is they have this extra capacity of um, of engaging with in a way with human communities, and which is kind of unique and special compared to other landscapes in the world, I feel. So I've tried to capture this, and as far as possible, going back to 0.7 billion years ago, when the first foundations of these landscapes, these highlands, were formed, to what's happening now with climate change and massive landslides, and almost like, yeah, the hills itself being endangered by destruction and climate change.
So can I add something that can I add?
Absolutely, please
Yeah.
do.
So actually not add. Continuing from where I left off, there's something that I want to bring in. There's another thing that stood out in the course of my journey was this very simple thing about how that I gathered from my learnings with the indigenous people was how we have forgotten how we relate with each other, with them, with other sentient beings, and in response to a point that you brought up in an email, Andrew, about where are we going wrong in our thinking about development? Are the key indicators and measures of development in health, education, economics ill-conceived or misguided, given the more holistic understandings of Nilgiris and biocultural environment? I labored on this a little bit, and it just distilled down to something very simple. And it came up today. Uh, I was in this. I'd like to start by. I started by saying that we have forgotten how to relate with one another, and it's something I want to bring into the context. I hope it is actually belongs in this context. So this morning, I was a part of the work. A class which was being taught by this brilliant thinker and photographer. And he read out one passage, but this was in a different context, in the context of storytelling and uh, expanding the storytelling process and thinking out of the box. So this is a little passage from, I'm going to read this out before I continue. Have you heard of this book, Indica by Pranay Lal? Um, Vasant, you'd be familiar with this book. Okay, I am in the process of reading this book, but there's a very interesting passage that gives us context of this development and what we are after. So this was, sorry, just bear with me. Yeah, astrophysicist Nigel Calder. Um, mm, so how this starts is, giving us uh, mm, the theory of how Earth came to be, how Sun came to be, and it's all really heavy and such. And then Pranay just quotes this by astrophysicist Nigel Calder. Nigel says, uh, have your readers imagine the 4,600 million year old Earth to be a 46-year-old woman. So basically, each year of her life is actually 100 million years. So what we are saying here is the Earth, let's look at the Earth as a 46-year-old woman. And she started to flower only at 45, which means, I'm just condensing all this, just 4 hours have elapsed since a new species calling itself Homo sapiens started chasing other animals. And in the last 4 hours, it has invented agriculture and settled down. A quarter of an hour ago, Moses led his people to safety across a crack in Earth's shell, and 5 minutes later, Jesus was preaching on a hill farther along the fault line. Just 1 minute has passed out of Mother Earth's 46 years since man began his industrial revolution 3 human lifetimes ago. That just taking all this into looking at it like this, we are not even fractions of seconds old. And what we are laboring in the name of development and the destruction that is being caused to all manner of sentient ecosystems. I don't know, I just felt with regard to all my interactions with indigenous people who see, actually are able to see it in this way, with this kind of sentence. I just thought I had to bring that into context with regard to development and how we are losing perspective of it. So,
Thank you. Ramya. Yeah, thank you, Ramya. You raise a very important point. I mean, both of you, Vasanth had made this point also about the precision, the kind of uncanny precision in nature, its unique calibration. And then you give us this wonderful longue durée in which that precision has persisted, and then the sort of last second interruption of human intervention. But I guess a point we want to underscore as well is the way in which the human communities of the Nilgiris also had a kind of unique precision in their interactions with the environment, even though maybe we're talking about thousands of years of adaptation and not, 100 million years of adaptation. But we really have very unique ecosystem interactivity between, for example, as Vasanth's work touches on and your work touches on, pollination and beekeeping and collecting honey, and also, of course, the kind of agricultural practices or horticultural practices by some of the lower elevation communities or the toras in the grasslands. Very unique adaptations of biocultural precision that, of course, are disrupted, and these disruptions caused by some of the modern developmental practices have impacts that are not just environmental, but cultural, psychological, spiritual, right? Because when one element of a life world changes in their environment, it has this cascading domino effect. And so the anxiety that people may feel in these modern times that may give them a feeling of, to use a Nilgiris phrase, the katte, the wind that comes and afflicts people, the katte karpa in this case, the kind of winds that bring a sort of darkness and sense of malevolence, are not simply independent of all these other forces, right? The kind of ecological changes, the changes in livelihoods. So this gives us a really great moment to ask Janagiamma to join the conversation and bring us her perspective as a community member, as a healer, as a senior leader, and as somebody who's been a bridge between worlds, between Keystone scientists, between international scientists instructing even students from the USA. She really brings a wealth of experience, and as a bridge between worlds, in addition to her role bringing information to different communities and her role with the newspaper that Keystone has run. So Janagiamma, please tell us a little bit about the changes you've seen and what gives you hope, and also what you might be a little bit worried about given what you see at the grassroots level. Thank you, Janagiamma. And thank you, Ramya and Vasanth, for fascinating discussion. We could go on forever, but unfortunately we have some limitations. Time limitations, that is. Janagiamma, please. Sarah is...
என்ன மாற்றம் வந்துச்சு நீல்கிரிஸ்ல, நீங்க உனக்கு எக்ஸ்பீரியன்ஸ்ல நீங்க கொஞ்சம் ஷேர் பண்ணுங்க.
மாற்றான வணக்கம். இப்போ மாற்றான வந்து சாப்பாடு வகையில ரொம்ப மாற்றமா இருக்காங்க மக்கள் வந்து நம்ம நீலகிரியில. ஃபர்ஸ்ட் சாப்பிட்டு இருந்தது வந்து தினை அரிசி, ராகி, இந்த மாதிரி காட்டுல கிடைக்கிற காய்கறிகள் வந்து இது எடுத்து சாப்பிடுவாங்க, விளைச்சுதான் சாப்பிடுவாங்க. இப்போ வந்து மூலிகை இந்த மருந்து அடிக்கிறத வாங்கி சாப்பிட்டு மக்களுக்கு வந்து ரொம்ப ஹெல்த் ரொம்பவா கம்மியா இருக்குது. எங்க இப்ப எல்லாம் ஹாஸ்பிட்டலுக்கு டெய்லி போகணும். ஃபர்ஸ்ட் அந்த மாதிரி ஹாஸ்பிட்டலுக்கு பிரசவத்துக்கு கூட ஹாஸ்பிட்டல் போக மாட்டாங்க. இப்போ இந்த இதுல வந்து ஹாஸ்பிட்டல் தான் முக்கியமா தேடிட்டு போறாங்க. அப்போ வந்து நாங்கெல்லாம் எங்க எங்க அனுபவத்திலேயே நாங்கெல்லாம் ஹாஸ்பிட்டல் போனது கம்மி. இப்போதான் ஹாஸ்பிட்டல் எந்த எடுத்தாலும் ஹாஸ்பிட்டல் போற மாதிரி இருக்குது. ஃபர்ஸ்ட் நாங்க சாப்பிட்டு இருந்ததுல இல்ல அதே மாதிரி சாப்பிட்டு இருந்தானா ஹெல்த் நல்லா நல்லா இருக்கும். இப்ப வந்து சாப்பாட்டுலதான் ரொம்ப மாற்றமா இருக்குது மக்களுக்கு. அதுவும் இந்த மூலிகை மருந்தெல்லாம் வந்து ரொம்ப அழிஞ்சிருச்சு. அதெல்லாம் இப்போ மறுபடியும் போய் பார்த்தாலும் மருந்து அந்த வகை மருந்துகள் எல்லாம் கிடைக்காது. ரொம்பவே வெறும் தோட்டம், டீ காடு அந்த மாதிரி ஆயிருக்கிறதுனால எல்லாமே மாறிடுச்சு. ஃபர்ஸ்ட் இந்த மாதிரி காட்டுல எந்த பொருளும் கிடைக்கிறது கம்மியா தான் இருக்குது.
Let me just
Vasanth,
yes. Sorry.
Vasanth,
Vasanth, you want to
Pratim.
translate it? Vasanth, can you translate?
Yeah, sure.
One thing I have to say, Janagiamma is also has delivered close to 50 babies in her lifetime, and she has midwifed. I mean, I don't know if I'm saying it right, but she has birthed all her 5 children herself.
5 children. Fantastic. Yeah, Vasanth, you would like to translate it, please?
Yeah, sure. So Janagiamma was saying that one of the main types of changes that have happened in her lifetime that she's seen is the change in food habits, and that people used to eat a lot of millets and greens from the forest and other items just from the forest. And now food habits have completely changed, and they depended completely on buying things from outside. And this has also affected the health of people. And before, no one would ever go to a hospital or a clinic. And but nowadays, everyone, even within the indigenous communities, they have to end up going to hospitals and clinics for even small things. And the other thing that she was saying is that because of habitat change and habitat loss, and there's a lot of tea, like almost 60% of the Nilgiris is tea now, tea plantations. And a lot of the ecosystems have changed, and medicinal plants that used to be plentiful everywhere we can't find that anymore. And that's a huge loss for them, because almost every plant is tied to their culture, and they have some use for it. And so the loss of that is a big impact.
Thank you, Vasanth, and Migavam Nandri Janagiamma. Would either of Ramya or Vasanth or Pratim like to address a question to Janagiamma now in the remaining time? I'd like to bring Pratim into the conversation as well to close us out, but I think Ramya and Vasanth and I myself have had very good and productive relationships with Janagiamma over the years, in which we've learned a lot from her. So I want to give you the chance to address a question to her.
Janagiamma, நான் ஒரு கேள்வி கேட்கிறேன் உங்களுக்கு. நீங்க எவ்வளவு வருஷம் நீல்கிரிஸ்ல வேலை செய்யச்சுல? நீங்க இங்கதான் நீல்கிரிஸ்ல இருக்க, குறும்பா ஹீலர் இருக்கு, ரம்யா சொல்லிட்ட மாதிரி நீங்க ஃபியூச்சர் எப்படி நீங்க பாக்குறீங்க? இதெல்லாம் பிரச்சனை சொல்லியாச்சு. இப்போ மக்கள் இந்த மாதிரி ட்ரெடிஷ்னல் மெடிசின் மூலிகை எல்லாம் சாப்பிட்டேன், இங்கிலீஷ் மெடிசின் தான் போறாங்க, ஹாஸ்பிட்டலுக்கு அடிக்கடி போறாங்க. அப்புறம் ஃபியூச்சர்ல நீங்க அடுத்த 10 வருஷம் இல்ல அடுத்த 5-20 வருஷம் நீங்க நீல்கிரி சிச்சுவேஷன் நீங்க எப்படி பாக்குறீங்க? உனக்கு எக்ஸ்பீரியன்ஸ்ல?
எனக்கு வந்து இப்போ நீலகிரிஸ்ல வந்து இப்போ நம்ம ஆதிவாசி நம்ம குறும்பாசி மக்களுக்கு வந்து மூலிகை செடி அந்த மாதிரி தேனைக்காடு சாப்பிட்றது அந்த இது வழக்கம். இப்போ வந்து அதெல்லாம் இல்லாம இருக்கறனால ரொம்ப மறுபடியும் அதை கொண்டாந்து அதே மாதிரி செஞ்சோன்னா நல்லா இருக்கும். மக்களுக்கு வந்து ஒரு விழிப்புணர்வு மாதிரி கொடுத்து அதை மாதிரி செஞ்சேன்னா நல்லா இருப்பாங்கன்னு நினைக்கிறேன். ஃபர்ஸ்ட் மாதிரியே இருக்கணும், அப்போதான் நல்ல மக்கள் வந்து நல்லா இருப்பாங்க. இப்போ திரைக்கடையெல்லாம் வச்சிருக்காங்க, தென்னை கடை வச்சு சாப்பிட்டு இருக்கவங்க சாப்பிட்டு இருக்காங்க, இல்லாட்டி கடையில போய் அந்த ரேஷன் அரிசி வாங்கிட்டு வந்து சாப்பிட்றவங்க இருக்காங்க. அதனால நம்ம கொஞ்சம் முயற்சி பண்ணி மக்களுக்கு அந்த மூலிகை செய்யறவங்களுக்கு அந்த செடி போடணும், இந்த மாதிரி அழிஞ்ச செடியெல்லாம் எடுத்து போட்டு அந்த மாதிரி கொஞ்சம் செஞ்சோன்னா நல்லா இருக்கும்.
Vasanth, do you want to translate that?
Yeah, sure. So Janagiamma is saying that like we have to change now, and that we have to bring back the old traditions of growing some of these crops and restoring habitats so that we get those indigenous species and medicinal plants, and try and regain space for forests and lost habitats. And so I guess she doesn't want to look at like what will happen if we don't make changes, but we have to make changes, and that's really important for our future.
I think the question that I asked is, what does she see as a future of the Nilgiris?
Yeah.
From her perspective and from her wisdom and insight.
Yeah.
So like Vasanth said, she says it's very important to go back to basics, literally, in a very simple way. She says it, that we need to get back to those roots again.
ஜானகியம்மா, எனக்கு ஒரு கொஸ்டின் இருக்கு. இப்போ சிவம்மா உங்க பொண்ணு காலேஜுக்கு போறாங்களே, எங்க ப்ராவிடன்ஸ் காலேஜ்ல படிக்கிறாங்க. இப்போ அவங்களுக்கு அங்கே கூட படிக்கிறாங்க, உங்ககிட்ட கூட மூலிகை கத்துக்கிறாங்க. இப்போ அவங்களுக்கு அங்க படிச்சு இங்க உங்ககிட்ட கூட கத்துக்கிறது ரெண்டுமே நடக்குது. நம்ம சிட்டி பசங்களுக்கெல்லாம் அப்படி இல்லை. இப்போ சிவம்மாக்கு இப்படி இது கூட உங்ககிட்ட கத்துக்கிறது கூட படிப்பு மாதிரி தோணுதா, இல்லைன்னா அது எப்படி இருக்கு? அப்புறமா அவங்களுக்கு காலேஜுக்கு போய் அந்த படிப்பு எப்படி தோணுது?
இப்போ அவங்களுக்கு வந்து காலேஜ் படிக்கும்போது காலேஜ் போய் படிக்கணும்னு படிக்கிறாங்க. அது இப்போ எல்லாம் படிப்பு தான் வேணுங்கிறாங்க. அதனால காலேஜ் படிக்கிறாங்க. படிச்சுட்டு வந்து நம்ம ஏதாச்சும் ஒரு மூலிகை செஞ்சானா, ஓ இது இந்த மாதிரி செய்யணுமா, இந்த செடியா அப்படிங்கிறது வந்து நம்ம கிட்ட கேட்டு அவங்க அதையும் படிச்சுட்டு இருக்காங்க. அப்ப அவங்க வருங்காலத்துக்கு அவங்களுக்கு வந்து அந்த படிப்பு வந்து அவங்களுக்கு தேவைப்படும். அதனால அவங்க அதுவும் படிக்கிறாங்க, காலேஜும் படிக்கிறாங்க.
அவங்களுக்கு உங்க இப்போ குருமா உங்க படிப்பு நீங்க கத்து கொடுக்கிறது அது how do I say, Vasanth, that is it equal to the Western education that she is getting? Is she looking at it in that way as a?
ஆமா, அதாவது அவங்க என்ன கேக்குறாங்கன்னா, இப்ப அவங்க காலேஜ்ல படிக்கிற விஷயம் வந்து நீங்க கத்து கொடுக்கறது, அதாவது நீங்க பாரம்பரிய அந்த அறிவு இருக்குல்ல, அதை வந்து நீங்க அவங்களுக்கு கத்து கொடுக்கறது வந்து சமமா நினைக்கிறாங்களா? அதுவும் தேவையானது, அதுவும் முக்கியமானதுன்னு நினைக்கிறாங்களா? இல்லைன்னா வந்து காலேஜ்லயும் ஸ்கூல்லயும் படிக்கிறது தான் அதுதான் ரொம்ப முக்கியம்னு நினைக்கிறாங்களா?
இப்போ அவங்களுக்கு ரெண்டும் முக்கியமா இருக்குது. காலேஜ்ல படிச்சானா அவங்க காலத்துக்கு வந்து சம்பாதிக்கிறதுக்கு அவங்க இது வருமானத்துக்கு அவங்க இது ஆயிரும். இது இந்த மூலிகை படிக்கிறது வந்து யாரோ நம்ம உடம்பு சரியில்லாம இருந்து வந்தாலும் சரி, அவங்க இதுல அவங்க குடும்பத்துக்கு அது ஆகும். இப்போ நான் இருக்கிற வரைக்கும் நான் செய்வேன், இல்லாட்டி அவங்க தான் அந்த இது செஞ்சு வரணும், அந்த மூலிகை செய்யணும், யாராச்சும் சொல்லணுங்கிறது அவங்க ரெண்டையும் படிச்சுதான் வரணுங்கிறது படிக்கிறாங்க. அது ஒரு பிள்ளைன்னு இல்லை, சிவம்மா மட்டும் இல்லை, எல்லா பசங்களும் படிக்கிறாங்க எங்க குடும்பத்துல.
ரொம்ப சந்தோஷம். Vasanth, you want to translate that? Yeah. My question was, Janagiamma's daughter Shivamma is studying economics. She's studying Bachelor in Economics at Providence College in Kunur. And up until now, her mom has also trained her, or is still doing that, in indigenous medicine, uh, passing on that precious legacy. My question to her was, does Shivamma view this uh, as uh, in equal capacity uh, for her, as in her education? Uh, what she's receiving is Western education, and do indigenous kids still perceive their indigenous knowledge in equal capacity? So, Vasanth, you want to say what she?
Yeah, I mean, so she was saying that nowadays they feel that both types of education are important, and that what they learn in school and college is important for making money and for that type of survival.
For also
And
community
that,
wellness, no? She said community wellness.
yeah, for overall community wellness and security, and that this form of knowledge and education, the traditional knowledge and education, is also really important because they get to know about traditions and medicinal plants, and that knowledge is not lost and is still kept alive. So yeah, youngsters, they find both important, is what she was saying.
Thank you, Rumba Nandri Janagiamma. I think that's a wonderful note to underscore that we're not advocating, Keystone is not advocating, community members are not advocating not gaining university education, not engaging with the wider society. It's not an attempt to turn the clock back necessarily. Addressing tradition and respecting some of the practices that were sustainable may be very, very important, but that doesn't mean turning one's back against the world entirely, because the world is more interconnected than ever. And here we are on a Zoom call exemplifying this quite nicely, with a global audience listening to an Alu Kurumba senior healer and 2 authors from the Nilgiris. I'm cognizant of the time, and while this conversation could go on much, much longer, I would invite Pratim to close out the conversation with a few words of his wisdom and his perspective on what we've heard, and his perspective on our 2 wonderful and very learned authors and their dedicated and very sophisticated work, which of course I hope everyone will have a chance to engage with their work. And then we'll open it up, the virtual floor, to questions from the audience.
Thank you, Andrew. And when I see Ramya and Vasanth and their work, it's actually a statement of life, and they are truly people who practice what they preach, and they're completely embedded and invested in the Nilgiris ecosystem, with plants, with people, with culture, with traditions. And that's not easy to come, because most often researchers, as we know, they would like to look at things very objective. They would like to measure things. They would like to scientifically quantify things. They would like to compare a Nilgiris to a Cape Town in terms of plants. That's another knowledge system. But here we have the beginnings of a pathway shown by 2 people who are actually living in many ways an Adivasi artist and ecology life. And that gives me a new hope and a very, very interesting excitement and journey towards what they have found out and still discovering. And we have Janagiamma here, who has been associated with all of us for such a long time, a complete practitioner. She relates to the work of Keystone and what she does in the Nilgiri Sudhi, the indigenous newspaper that she brings out, and the healing that she does. She feels completely, absolutely like an active participant in this entire experiment, so to say, if I may call it. So we have today authors who have lived this experience, who have seen perspectives. We have a healer who is explaining how the real life works. And we have Andrew, I must say, who has brought an excellent perspective from an anthropological, from an indigenous, from a very local perspective, and bringing the academic, bringing the cultural nuances to something so complex as this. So the talk gives a lot of food for thought for all of us, because it comes back to each of us and what kind of difference we make in our lives, in the Nilgiris, and wherever we are for that matter. With that, thank you, Andrew, for this opportunity, and I'll open up the floor for a few questions. I'm also aware of the time, but let's have a couple of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Pratim. And thank you, Vasanth, Ramya, Janagiamma, and thank you to the audience as well. Who will moderate the questions, or are they coming in the chat? Or
Yeah, there's one in the chat. Has there been a shift in local population moving to cities, and how has that had an impact on culture change here at the Nilgiris? From my experience, with the Adivasi communities, I don't think their move to the cities has had such an impact on the culture change in the Nilgiris. I do see, for example, youngsters coming back when there is a honey harvest, for instance.
Yeah.
Wherever they are, they come back no matter what and participate. And I know of Toda kids, college-going kids, who are very much rooted, and they come back for important occasions. And I don't see that happening with the Adivasi communities. I do see that with a native community, which is the Barga community. They're much larger, and they much more urbane. So yeah, I don't see that with Adivasi communities, but not just as yet.
Vasanth, do you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I would agree with what Ramya said. And in terms of like overall population numbers, I think Nilgiri's district is one of the few districts in South India that has a reducing population, and this is because of people, locals moving out, and yeah, in search of different kinds of jobs. So culturally, yes, culturally as well as like landscape wise, it's changing because there are a lot of other people coming in who are, I mean, the landscape is changing like in a way where it's becoming more like a holiday place, and people come to have their second homes, and a lot of construction is happening because of that. So people who have been living closer to the land and working with the land are either leaving or it's becoming harder and harder because of changes in the habitat, climate change, and other pressures. Yeah.
Vasanth Nayak asked to Janagiamma, what is the one thing she misses from childhood, growing up in a more natural setting? What is missing that she would want back? Can
Vasanth,
Pratim-
can you just translate that with Janagiamma?
Oh yeah, sure. Janagiamma, நீங்க நீங்க இந்த குழந்தை பருவத்துல வந்து ஒரு விஷயம் அப்போ இருந்தது, இப்போ அது இல்ல. அது வந்து நீங்க ரொம்ப அதை வந்து அது இருந்திருந்தா நல்லா இருக்கும். நீங்க அப்போ குழந்தையா இருக்கும்போது ஏதாவது அப்படி இருந்துச்சா இப்போ இல்லாதது?
குழந்தை பருவத்துலன்னா குழந்தை பருவத்துல ஞாபகம் அவ்வளவுக்கு வர்றது.
சரி, நீங்க சின்ன வயசுல இருக்கும்போது, அதாவது நீங்க அப்போ இருந்தப்போ எங்க காடுகள்லாம் எப்படி இருந்துச்சு, நாங்க வளர்ந்த விதம் இப்படி
இப்போ நாங்க சின்ன எங்களுக்கு விவரம் தெரிஞ்ச காலத்துல இருந்து அப்போ பார்த்தோன்னா நல்ல இப்போ வெளிர் கொம்பைன்னு எடுத்தாவே நல்லா இருந்துச்சு. யாரும் மாமரத்துல வந்து பார்த்தாவே வெளிர் கொம்பியா அப்படின்னு பயப்படுவாங்க. இப்ப வந்தானா யாரும் வெளிர் கொம்பியா ஆச்சே அங்க யார் போவா அப்படிங்கிற மாதிரி இருக்குது. வெளிர் கொம்பைன்னா எல்லாரும் வர்றதுக்கு தொடங்கி வருவாங்க. இப்ப வெளிர் கொம்பை பார்த்தோன்னா வர முடியாம அந்த ஒரு சூழ்நிலை இருக்குது. அப்போ நல்லா இருந்துச்சு. இப்போ ரொம்பவே இதாயிடுச்சு. எல்லாமே பணத்துக்காக வெளி வேலைக்கு போயிட்டு நம்ம சொந்த இது பாக்குறது இல்ல. அப்ப சின்னதுல நாங்க இந்த இதுல வந்து தெனைக்காடும் வாழை அந்த மாதிரி போட்டு நல்லா இது இருந்துச்சு. இப்ப வந்து அந்த இதே இல்லை. விவசாயங்கிறது செய்யாம வெறும் பணத்துக்காக ஆசைப்பட்டு போற மாதிரி இருக்குது இந்த காலத்துல. அந்த காலத்துல அப்படி இல்லை.
Andrew, can I take the liberty of saying something?
Prabhu, just 1 second.
Yeah, sure.
We'll just
Translate.
let, for a moment, Vasanth translate what
Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry.
Just
Okay.
1 second. Yeah.
So Janagiamma was saying that just her village itself, like it used to be surrounded by forest and like quite pristine and nestled in the forest, and people used to, like, if they wanted to come, it used to be like you had to walk through a lot of forest to come and come to that place, and there used to be a kind of awe of that whole village. But now people are like, oh, who will go there? And it's this kind of like closer. There's the large state highway that goes close by also, and so that whole pristineness, if you can say, is gone. And then she was saying how again, like because of the degradation of the forest, the medicinal plants have gone, and farming practices have changed. So these are the things that she missed from her childhood.
Thank you. Prabhu, please.
Yeah, just a quick statement and one question. The statement being that I've been a part-time resident of Kotagiri for many years now, and I'm ashamed to say that I just see it like a second home. I never knew of the richness of what people like Vasanth or Pratim or Ramya have been doing. I was just seeing the map of Vasanth, the one that he created, and I'm fascinated because one of the things talked about encroachment by urban settlers. And I'm just thinking that I'm a part of that. So it's very sad in a way. I should be ashamed and humbled by all this, but I'm glad he raised a larger question, and I'm as much a perpetrator as the Nilgiris victim. But the question I want to ask is that it's we find ourselves in a situation where it's very fashionable to keep the tribes and keep the people of the Nilgiris in their space, assuming that we know more about them than they do about themselves. For example, we put them in a situation where we recognize the richness of what they are, but we know it because we have gone through the bad times. But is it worth the democratic process to allow them to experience what we know? And then how do we then go back to it? It's much like a benevolent dictator. So is there a long-term plan to merge the goodness, for example, the medicinal plants that Janagiamma was talking about? How does one merge or marry the modern world and the world that they live in obviously both have benefits. How does one do it? Is there a sustainable plan to do this for the foreseeable future before those ways of life disappear? That's my question.
Thank you,
Uh,
Pratim. Big
one,
question.
yeah, it's a big question, and there's so many. It's a longer discussion. But one thing that immediately comes to my mind, and something that I feel passionately about, is to bring the change at the grassroots level, which would be education in schools, and to because the popular assumption is even the indigenous kids should join the fold of Western education systems. But can it be the other way around? It doesn't even have to be other way around. Is there a way to implement, or for the city kids to imbibe some of that, and for the indigenous kids also to bring in this as a part of their curriculum? How can we bring it at the grassroots level in education, in schools, for indigenous kids and city dwellers too? So this is something that
Yeah, that's a great point, Ramya. And I would just add a footnote. One of the things that came up in our Nilgiri Field Learning Center discussions between Cornell students and Adivasi students was education, and the desire for education, for higher education among the local students. Again, that kind of bridging of worlds, but not losing oneself in the process, not losing one's identity. But when they talked about education, they talked about it twofold: gaining outside knowledge and connecting with universities and other occupational training was very important to the local Adivasi students. But they also underscored that the education has to be two-way. The outside world has to become better educated so that they don't look at us with an objectifying, museifying gaze, which is sort of what Prabhu was getting at, which has, sort of teleological assumptions about development: who's more developed, who's less developed, and exoticizes people in a way that is infantilizing and frankly, not taking knowledge seriously. And so they saw education as a two-way street. They perceive that the outside world has to become better educated so they don't have that paternalistic approach to us and approach development in that way of thinking. Vasanth, do you want to weigh in on Prabhu's massive question? And of course, we could also say Pratim's life work is also so addressed to that question, but Vasanth, you go first.
Yeah, sure. So in fact, like, this is something that I've looked at in my book also, is as a person from the not from an indigenous community, like how do we get the rest of the dominant culture to bridge that gap, bridge the disconnect, and make that big change. So like one of the questions and aspects that I've looked at is like what indigenous people have always said, is that the land is alive and that it's sentient, and I feel that's the basis of everything, because like modern, like dominant human culture, civilization is completely based on the destructive utilization of land, and everything is based on either over-tilling it so that you have agriculture, or you have like materials made out of digging things out of the land. So I think that's where the major shift happened, in where indigenous people consider the land to be alive, and they didn't do all of that. And so in my book, like I look at this, I provide this evidence of the land actually being alive, and I provide scientific evidence, like evidence that science can actually see. It's verifiable, empirical evidence that's repeatable. So in a way, I'm trying to bridge what the indigenous people have always said, but then look at it from, look at it from the geology and ecology aspect, like, and try and communicate to science, and then everyone who, and then the whole of the dominant culture is based on that, like based on, considers science to be the pinnacle of all knowledge. So yeah, this is how I've tried to address it, and hopefully these kind of changes will happen, and this understanding will spread.
Vasanth, I have great admiration for you for putting that research forth about the sentience of the mountains, and providing your evidence and empirical evidence, scientific evidence, and taking on various scientific communities with so much. I'm sure you faced a lot of criticism and counterpoints on that one. And I think you also mentioned it in the book, and I think that was very brave and for you to put it out there. And I believe that 100%. And you provide an incredible, fascinating example of the Southwest Monsoon, was it? I think you should just say it here, and people should listen to that. How the mountains shifted or turned. Yeah.
So I basically look at how this part of the peninsula actually gets both the monsoons, the southwest and the northeast. And it's not by coincidence, just by coincidence, that all the three sister landscapes have risen to almost equal elevation in this place where both the monsoons meet. And with elevation, there is this incredible capacity to capture more moisture and provide for more life. And so digging into the geological origins of all these three sister landscapes, they're all quite different from each other, but then the final manifestation of their elevation and shapes of hills within the plateau is just incredible, and in how precise they've been oriented towards the wind patterns. Like, for example, the highest places of all the three landscapes are all pointing towards the strongest wind directions, and these are all different with all the three landscapes. So like this, I've looked at various other heterogeneities, which all just digging a little bit deeper shows an incredible precision and a knowledge that the monsoons were forming. So, for example, the final elevation of the three landscapes from about 1,000 meters to 2,000 meters that they are now happened exactly at the same time when the monsoons were also starting to form in this region. So,
brilliant.
Thank you for the wonderful illustration. It makes me feel very inspired, but also a sense of humility at how much I don't know and how much I need to learn. And I think a good dose of humility will go a long way in appreciating this complexity. Pratim, I see the time, and I think
we should close.
Yeah, I think we should.
Yeah.
Can you give us a few closing words?
No, I think Prabhu's question, like, it needs a whole day and an evening. And I would welcome you to Kotagiri. You're in Kotagiri. I would welcome you to Keystone and look at a little lens that we have developed in the last 28 years to address some of the questions, because no one size fits all. There are different paths. I don't think there's one plan. There are several plans, and it's very dynamic. It changes all the time. One has to be very creative and imaginative. But yeah, there are answers, there are insights, there are inroads. It's not all lost. So yeah, I would end at that. And thank you so much for coming this evening to the Nilgiris Foundation and the Nilgiri Field Learning Center webinar. I see that we had almost 23 people. Some people have dropped out now.
We had 29 people.
We had 29. That's great. That's great. And thank you so much. And we look forward to the next webinar, which we will plan to have it in January. We are trying to make this a monthly thing so that we all can meet within the Nilgiri community and exchange these kind of interesting ideas and experiences from all over the world for this particular hill range in the Western Ghats. With that, good night and good morning, Andrew. I guess you've got classes ahead, and all the best to everybody. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
You.
Janagiamma, romba nandri.
ரொம்ப நன்றி.
Romba nandri.
ரொம்ப நன்றி சொல்லுங்க.
Thanks.
Yeah.
போயிட்டு வரேன். Bye. Good night.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.